Hey guys, welcome back to Metatrends with Mark and Mike. We have with us Tash Salas. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, she is an attorney who sets up family offices. We're going to be talking about investing and what have you. This is kind of a mysterious, interesting world. But we were actually just talking off air about some of the differences between Southern Hispanics in the United States versus Western, and not everyone is exactly the same. You're talking about a lot of different cultures that just happen to speak Spanish, that type of thing. Maybe that's the unifying thing. Like what I want to say between Mike and Tosh, the have you guys ever seen the movie The Pope of Greenwich Village?
I don't think so.
Oh, you guys gotta see that movie. It's a great movie, right? So it's, early Eric Roberts and, Mickey Williams, I think that was his name. So really good stuff. At one point, one of the guys turns to the 2 Italians who are kinda quasi mafioso in Little Italy, and he goes, "Well, you guys are Italian. That's like being twin brothers to the Irish." Right? So there are cultural differences here. So, yeah, but the whole idea is it's interesting to me about the politics, what you were talking about off air, Mike. So why don't you bring us back to that for a moment? Maybe you guys can discuss it between the 2 of you.
Yeah, it's just, if you don't understand, which many folks don't, really, they say, "Well, you're Hispanic, so you're either Mexican or insert whichever other nationality." Number 1, I think it's important to note the majority of Hispanics in the United States are Americans who were born there now, born in the United States. They
Yeah.
have it's no different than saying, "Well, my I'm an American, but my family's of Italian origin," but most Hispanics now, demographically, were born in the United States like I was, to Cuban American or Mexican American or whatever, maybe Central South American, Caribbean, American parents. And when you get into the politics of it, they they're regional. There are regional differences because of their cultural backgrounds. Florida Hispanics tend to lean much more conservative and much more towards the Republican Party traditionally, because of the fact that until a little while ago, about 50% of the Hispanics in the state of Florida were of Cuban origin, and roughly 7 out of 10 Cuban American registered voters vote for the Republican Party. But that's not the same, let's say, in Arizona or Nevada or New Mexico or California or even New York, where you are, Mark. That there are differences, and they're not monolithic. It's not a monolithic group. You're Hispanic, so these are the characteristics of a Hispanic voter. You really don't know because Hispanics have assimilated. They and many of them, like myself, we identify as Americans first. I may eat pork on Noche Buena, Christmas Eve, because especially Cubans, they celebrate the night before Christmas as if it is Christmas with a pig roast. A gahachina sometimes is what they use to cook it. But that's a nice tradition, but I'm an American. So I don't really pay much attention to what's happening on the island where my grandparents and parents were from. So I think that's the most important
I'm curious
mis
about something here, Mike, and I
yeah.
think you guys are qualified to answer me this, right? So picture, about 7 years ago, the one Miami Dolphins Jet game I've been to where we won, meaning the Jets did, was in London. So we actually me and my buds flew to London, watched the Jets destroy the Miami Dolphins to the point where you guys actually fired your head coach on the flight back. But what was weird was I didn't know I had a heart condition at the time. I just knew I really wasn't able to walk, around London the way my buddies were. And they actually said, "Hey, we booked a walking tour of London," and I was like, "Enjoy yourselves," right? So I went to the pub, and I ended up hanging out with this guy who was from Yorkshire. And, he turns to me at one point and he goes, Yorkshire's like where, very wealthy Londoners have summer houses, right? So it's supposed to be a beautiful area of England, and, but they speak differently there. So at one point, he turns to me and he goes I said to him, "What's your name?" And he goes, "Mac." I said, "Oh, okay." And he starts this conversation. It goes on and on and on. About a half an hour later, he goes, "What's your name?" I said, "Mark." He goes, "Oh, like me." Okay, wait, now you said Mac. I'm thinking MAC, right? And I said, I realized this guy needs subtitles." And then as he got loaded, he needed bigger subtitles because at one point his whole family was there too, which is kinda odd sitting him drinking with your family, right? So it was like even grandchildren were in the, pub with us. They couldn't understand him either. right? Based on how loaded he got. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, you don't speak English, you speak Yorkshire. So what
Mhm.
I'm curious about to people, especially someone like me who just butchers foreign languages, so it's like I actually, believe it or not, I had to take sign language to honor my language credits in college. That I aced, but I failed Spanish 5 times. I'm wondering if you get into conversations with someone who speaks Spanish, and because of where they're from, you can't understand what they're saying either.
Yeah, from Chile, people from Chile, and they know it. Like,
Really?
all the Chilean people I've met in the US, they've adjusted their accent, like,
Really?
a lot. Like, my some of my best friends, they're from Chile, and I always tell them, like, "You don't sound like," and she's like, "Because you haven't heard me at home. Like, you wouldn't understand a word in Spanish or English." And when we in Mexico, at least, when we watch, movies in Spanish, but from Spain, we need subtitles. It's really, really hard to understand what they're saying, and even some words, it's just like it's so different, and not just like culturally, because obviously there's huge gaps between cultures, but just like the Spanish that we use and the accents. One thing that it always like I find it funny is that they ask me like, "Am I pronouncing your name right?" I'm like, "I'm Mexican. I don't know." Like, the accent for me is not something that I really pay attention to. So yeah, there's just like so many differences among us, and I just think it's really funny, kind of insulting, but really funny that everybody's just like, "Oh, the Mexican countries." Oh my
It's like what's funny is that when people think I'm English or they think I'm, whatever, I don't get insulted. You know what I mean? Like, how the hell would they know if I'm Irish or English or whatever, you know?
Right.
Like, at one point, my wife and I were at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, and she speaks fluent Italian because she lived in Italy for a year in college,
Oh, very nice.
and which is awesome for someone like me because I can just turn to her and she translate for me, and that language is gorgeous. Like, this one word was so beautiful and sensual. I said, "What's that word mean?" She said, "Overpass." I'm like, "You gotta love a language that makes overpass sound sensual." I said, "What's the word for dumpster?" And that was even kinda nice too, you know? So it was a really cool experience, but the best part was we're standing next to each other. Now she's of Irish and Norwegian descent, so she's blonde-haired, blue-eyed, all that stuff, and we're standing next to each other, and one of the callers for bus tours and things like that comes over to us and tries to speak to us in, like, 7 different languages and didn't know we were American. And we were like and we sat back and I'm like, "Actually, that was kind of a compliment." We don't look American. You know what I mean?
That's so funny.
So I
The
don't get
Italian
offended by
word
that.
for overpass is calvacadia,
It
apparently.
Yeah, it was beautiful, you know?
It does sound beautiful, but to your point, yes, there are differences. At least I've noticed that oftentimes Spaniards they have the accent which is theta with the th at the end of every word, and the faster they speak, the more difficult it is to understand. Even though that's where we all kind of originated from in the Spanish language, apparently. But it's interesting because then we're seeing a mix now. There's actually a language um, or not a language, excuse me, but there it's recognized as a Miami dialect, Miami accent, because what you have had is folks who grow up bilingual, but you could communicate with your parents in English, but your grandparents probably not. So you mix the two languages, and you may actually start a sentence and finish it in two different languages. So you could say, "Abuela, yo estaba en school today," which means I was in school today, but
Mhm.
instead of saying it all in one language, and then they'd understand. It was like my grandfather until he passed, uh, didn't really speak English, didn't really understand it, but he always loved to watch Law and Order on television, and he would say, "No, this was a good episode," and I'd ask him, "But how do you know?" I don't. I mean, I'm not understanding how you actually understand what, Mariska Hargitay is saying as Detective Benson. But it's just it's a different experience. I do think that helps us also, um, because of how the business world has evolved, and not just the US population, but the world of business, how it's evolved, that we're doing this now in 3 separate cities, 2 different countries, and we can or actually, if you count Noah, four different, two different countries and different states. Um, you having to have that balance, how it is, how you communicate, with whom you communicate, how you explain yourself, how you prepare yourself for meetings, I think has benefited a lot of Hispanics
Yeah.
in the United States because we've had to grow up in two, sometimes three languages.
Well,
Mhm.
there's a whole thing in there too about the statistics behind it too, if I'm not boring you guys. So we did an analysis of Philadelphia. The only ethnicity that is not in steep decline in Philadelphia are Latin Americans. So it's like, so I was discussing this with a professor out of York College of Pennsylvania. So, because he works closely with credit unions, so he came to them and suggested that they change the what would you call it, like the interior decoration of each of their units to be more Latin American centric. So, and then there's a thing too about how you know how like when they you'll hear people talk about how certain ethnicities struggle financially the compared to others, and Latin Americans are one of those. But what they don't know is the average age of the Latin Americans is so much younger than the average age of, let's say, Caucasians. I think the average age of Caucasians in the United States is 48 years old. The average age of Latin Americans in the United States is something like 18.
Oh, wow.
So as soon as you hear that, it's like, okay, well now I think you guys have a serious advantage in learning other languages. 'Cause, you know, when I'm in Quebec or what have you speaking, I open up with, if you speak three languages, you're trilingual. If you speak two languages, you're bilingual. If you speak one language, you're American.
Yeah.
And they all crack up over that one.
It's so true.
It's true. So it's like we kind of didn't have to, and I think it was kind of a cheat code in the past because English became the language of money. So now it's a universal language. But when I was in Italy, I've been there twice with my wife. She's been there many, many, many times because she's a liaison for the two parks. It's called the Pine Barrens Commission. But the idea is, what I noticed was everyone a day younger than me spoke English proportional to how much a day younger they were than me. So the younger they were, the more English they spoke. If they were my age, they spoke no English whatsoever, and anyone older than me spoke zero. So we needed to surround ourselves with the young ones so they would translate for us, or at least especially me. You know, like my wife taught me like restaurant Italian by the end of the first week. But the deal was is to, like the 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 people in Florence are kind of snooty about the language. I said to him, I said, I get the impression that in Florence you speak proper Italian, and every Florentine that was sitting at the dinner table all put up their fingers like this, and he said, "No, no, no. In Florence, we speak Italian. Everywhere else, they speak something else." And I was like, "Snobs."
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that's the thing. So, it's just kinda how it is. But why don't we get back into, the business side of all of this. So, Tosh, why don't you tell us where you're at now, what got you to where you are, and then in the first portion of this, before we go to the middle market forum, we like to talk about, like, entrepreneurism. So, someone like Noah's age who wants to own a business, and your world is particularly mysterious. I'll give you an example, I'll set this up. I got approached by a guy who sold a medical school in Grenada, um, a couple of years back, and he sold it for $750 million. Very wealthy man. Supposedly he wanted to become a billionaire. So I was approached by his handlers who said to me, "Mark, do you know any companies that are in the 25 to $50 million range where we could invest in, lend money to, buy, flip, that type of thing?" And I said to him, "You need to be a lot more specific." Because, I spoke to 4,200 last year alone. So tell me what's going on. And they said, well, this guy sold his company for $750 million. So it actually made me sit down and write out the formula about how to take a company from 25 million to 125 million in as short as 5 years. Right. So, but I also noticed a dynamic with this, and this is where I think you giving us the practical versus the romantic side of investor. I've noticed that like there was a movie recently called Argo, and it was about a CIA operative faking doing the next Star Wars. This is in '79, so they could rescue the Iranian hostages. So they actually had to go to Hollywood, fake setting up a movie production, buy a script, negotiate with all this type of stuff. So if anyone called back to Hollywood, they're legit. They're going to be doing a movie. And John Goodman's character, who's kind of the grizzled veteran, turns to Ben Affleck's character, who's the CIA operative. He goes, "Let me get this straight. You don't have any money, but you're gonna come to Hollywood, flash some money like you got money. You're gonna pretend to make a movie, but you're not gonna make a movie." And he goes, "Yeah. Isn't that how you fit right in?" So my experience with investors is kinda like that. They're more almost romantic about the title as opposed to practical about the application. So I'm looking forward into getting into, like, what's the practical application of this instead of the romantic side. And then I think in this case, I'm glad you're hearing this, Mike, because, Tosh and I have been having a conversation probably for about a year now about building an organization that caters to investors and investments. So in some ways, we have to firewall that because frankly, you go to any type of conference around M&A, and it's like being if you're not an M&A advisor or investment banker, it's like being accosted. It's like being like the hottest girl at Mardi Gras on the worst night of the year, right? So it's like Viking stuff happens. So what we got to do is kind of firewall that so that this way people who are true investments, of which I have a ton of contacts that way. What I don't have is a ton of investors that way because despite the fact I'm a fiduciary wealth manager, being a retail wealth manager means you cannot deal with institutional money and vice versa. So it's the institutional money, the institutional investors, the family offices, the private equity. I'm only just starting to wade into that water, and that's the waters you swim in, Tosh. So why don't you bring us up to speed? What got you to here? And then what are the trends that you're seeing in that marketplace?
Yeah. Well, definitely what got me here is that, coming from a country, Mexico, where we don't have the finance world so developed as in the US, and then moving to California, Silicon Valley, where, it's like the epicenter of venture capital, right? You have to notice differences, right? And then, if you're curious, you start wondering like, who caters to these investors? What are you catering, right? So my journey really started in insurance, in very small policies, actually a little bit going back to the beginning of our conversation, selling to union workers and learning how to communicate with a totally different type of people that I've ever been surrounded with, right? So I was just like, wow, I'm selling them this type of investment. And I remember having conversations with the union workers, and at the end of the call, the end of the sale, uh, they would say like, "So this is something like insurance, right?" So I never really mentioned the word insurance during I just showed them the benefits, why they needed it, and they were like, "So Tash, this is like insurance, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, very very close. Just don't cancel it, okay? You're good." And then I really realized how powerful some of these investments are, like the insurance policies, right? But I realized that, I was not really explaining it to them. And it was just like, wow, I just feel like this is something that everybody should understand better. So I went up market and I literally did this in San Jose, California. I was talking to everyone and said, please introduce me to the most sophisticated life insurance person that you know. And I realized that there are not many. Right? So that got me into a different like spiral. So I learned a lot about the internal structures of life insurance by myself, and that was a lot frustrating. Then I went to San Francisco, and that's where I started more like navigating the world of venture capital, finding the clients for a much more sophisticated product of life insurance. So that's where I really met the family office world. So I met these, ultra high net worth individuals who had a sale for, over $50 million. And they, you know, became my friends. And eventually some of my friends, they were like, hey, you should come to me to this event. And it's like, okay. They gave me a tag and I was part of like this family office. And I was like, what is a family office? So I was like, okay, obviously people don't know about insurance. Why would they even understand this like super like mystic world of family offices, right? So I went to several events and I realized that, you know, the advisors there are not much better. than the people that cater to middle class,
Mhm.
right? Which is terrible because, you would not recommend the same type of investments. You would not recommend the same strategies, techniques, and everything to someone that earns $100,000 a year, $1 million, $10 million. So it's just very different. So I went there and I just said, wow, I really want to get into the type of investments that I see my best friends getting into, which are not traditional investments, right? So alternative investments. So from that, I really navigated like real estate. I help commercial real estate investors with, in the Bay Area, to be fair, a property worth $30 million is like really small.
Yeah.
Right? So, like I help investors like that, just like to get my it wet. Then I went into venture capital very quickly. I was a fund administrator for around 18 funds. Then I was like, okay, I learned what I needed to learn. Then I went into family office. And the family office, that was the shocking part for me, the most shocking part for me of everything, right? Because you describe it perfectly. There's a lot of people calling themselves family offices and they're not. I actually call many of my friends and I was like, remember you call yourself family office? You're not. And they were like, what are you talking about? I'm like, you're not. You're an investor, you're a direct investor, you're an ultra wealthy individual that you have the desire to investors in certain companies, but a multifamily or a single family office is actually a firm. It's a well structured, you know, um, firm in with different areas that will cater to ultra high net worth individuals, either one or several, or families, right? And at least on social media, I always call out people that keep calling investors family offices because they're not.
Mm,
And I think, to your experience, Mark, you cannot recommend the same investment to someone who's an institution and can diversify their portfolio versus an individual investor who really cannot diversify that much and should not. They should, but they should not go like super broad, or they should not try to get into private equity, for example. If you're an ultra wealthy individual, you cannot really get into private equity. You can play the private equity rules, but you cannot get into private equity. You need a lot of capital to do that, right? So yeah, to your point, there's a lot of um, like flashy names out there. I don't think it's the investor's fault. I think it's the scammer's fault.
mm,
The scammers that have, labeled themselves that way because it's easier to get into deals, it's easier to get information. When if you just say, "Hey, I'm a broker in progress," nobody's going to, pay attention to you. So, and on the other side, on the business side, or the people raising capital or looking for partnerships, because it's not their world, and family offices are not like they're not mandated to register anywhere unless there's like a certain threshold or things like that. So how do you know, right? So we're all living in a world where they're not regulated as normal institutional investors. You cannot find them, you cannot vet them. So we are really at, the will of the market. It's terrible. It's a waste of time. Sometimes there's scams, often not. It's just a lot of waste of time.
mm. Well, there's even a thing too that I noticed that with family offices, they're almost the legit ones. They there is some type of quota that they have to investigate enough actual investment opportunities. So for the people who are actually so picture there's like a trifecta here.
Hmm.
You have like let's say I sit on the board of a software for healthcare company that is tasked with minimizing medical error. Now this is something that's a burgeoning science, let's call it, but the demand for this is going to balloon like you wouldn't believe over the next 15 years. Just simply with the aging of the population, you're going to have more and more and more people die from needlessly in hospitals because hospitals are, this is going to sound terrible, but they kill more people a day than plane crashes do. yet no one knows about this. So what happens is that the government is now starting to force that onto them, that they have to improve their record about this. So I think the demand for this sort of thing is gonna balloon. But the guy's like walking around with a tin cup saying, "Can you invest in my company? Can you invest in my company? Can you invest in my company? Can you invest in my company?" And I think the real reason why is because of Sarbanes-Oxley. So Sarbanes-Oxley comes out in 2002 to end the Enrons of the world and the Wolf of Wall Streets of the world, and it did. It succeeded. So we lost the second, third, and fourth tier of investment banking. What happened though is the downside of it is it's so prohibitively expensive to be Sarbanes compliant that you have to be doing more than 650 million a year in revenue to really warrant going public. See, when I first got into Wall Street in 1989, we had individual stocks that were going up 3,000% per year. Those don't exist anymore because those were micro caps. Now you could get away with that back then, but it was also like the Wild West. You had the Wolf of Wall Street guys, the penny stock brokers, all that type of stuff, who were thieves, like literally deserving of going to jail. So it was so Wild West that the politicians clamped down on it with Sarbanes-Oxley, and it succeeded. It's so prohibitively expensive to be Sarbanes compliant now. You have to be such a large company that we don't have explosive rates of return. So there's less drama in the market, which the politicians prefer. The dilemma is the rates of return have gone to like tepid single digit rates of return, which actually gives rise to private equity. It gives rise to this private middle market thing. I call it the secret stock market. So that's going to be a book that I'll write with that title. Hopefully, no one will steal that title now that I said it live on the air. But the idea is that this dynamic killed the high flying stocks, created the alternative markets. So you had the rise in hedge funds and you had the rise in private equity as a result, proportional to how many investment banks went under as a result of this. Well, let me just tell you how powerful this is. In 2002, prior to Sarbanes, MSNBC covered the stock market. Sarbanes comes out and they switch to covering politics because the stock market's a snooze fest now. So the dilemma is that now you have quality companies out there. I speak to them regularly. I spoke to 60 of them this past week in Omaha, Nebraska. They would have qualified to go public back in 1989. Every one of them in the room. Now there's no way they could, probably ever. So that means you have this dearth of funding for these certain categories of investments. Even the politicians, like I was sitting next to my sitting congressman on a flight to BWI, and he brought this up to me. I didn't even bring it up to him. I said, well, this is my opinion about what's causing this. So we need a category that can help fund companies that are between, like, let's call it 20 million and 200 million. It's kind of a dead zone that doesn't get to actually be funded. So I'm thinking that we could fill that void. So
Mhm.
with something like you're referring to, you know. So Mike, were there any questions that you had?
Um, Honestly, it's an area that I only get into when one of maybe your clients has a crisis communication issue. So everything you are
Oh, no problem,
saying
no problem.
is everything you are saying is actually educational for me.
All
So
right, so
I'm
then
just doing more listening.
all right, so then buckle up. We're gonna take this over to the middle market forum.